Mail-order bride rejected at the depot.
Until a cowboy lifted her trunk and took her home. The snow fell hard across the wide Montana plains, covering everything in a thick white blanket. The wind whipped across the fields, making the few trees bend and groan under its force.
A cowboy, a man with weathered skin and a worn hat pulled low over his eyes, walked carefully along the fence line. His boots crunched in the snow, and every step left a clear mark that the wind quickly tried to erase. The air was so cold that even the thick gloves he wore seemed not enough to keep his hands warm. He had been alone on this land for many years. His cabin was small, made of rough-hewn logs, with a stone fireplace at one end and a few pieces of furniture inside. It was simple, but it was his home, and it had kept him safe through countless winters. The winter this year was harsher than most. Snowstorms came more often, and the wind seemed sharper, cutting through coats and blankets like knives. Still, he had to check his fences. Without proper care, the fences could break, letting the cattle escape, which could mean disaster for him. As he worked, hammering and tying loose posts, he thought about the silence of the land. Sometimes it was peaceful, almost comforting, but at other times it was lonely. He had grown used to it, but on nights like these, when the wind screamed and the world seemed covered in endless white, the loneliness pressed against him. He looked up at the sky, where snow clouds moved quickly, and he wondered how long this storm would last. That was when he noticed something unusual. Among the footprints that were already in the snow, there was a set that did not belong to him or his cattle. The tracks were smaller, lighter, and more deliberate. They led toward his cabin, and they were fresh. He paused, placing his hand on the hammer in his belt. His eyes narrowed. A stranger was coming toward him, and in a place like this, strangers were rare and sometimes dangerous. The sound of the wind masked any other noise, but he could see the figure approaching, walking slowly through the deep snow. As the figure came closer, he could make out that it was a woman. She was wrapped in several layers of cloth, but the wind had blown her hood back, and her hair whipped across her face. She moved with caution, as if afraid to slip in the snow, yet with determination, refusing to turn back. When she reached the edge of his property, she spoke. Her voice was soft, but carried over the wind enough for him to hear. "Sir," she said, shivering, "may I sleep in your cabin?" "It's freezing outside." The cowboy studied her. Her face was pale from the cold, her eyes wide, and her lips blue. There was no trace of anger or threat in her expression, only fear and exhaustion. He could see her hands, red and stiff from the cold, clenching and unclenching as if she didn't know what to do with them. He knew she had been traveling for some distance, and the snow around her told a story of struggle, of being lost in the storm. He hesitated. His mind raced through the old lessons he had learned living alone in the wild. Strangers could be dangerous. A traveler could be desperate or dishonest. He could be risking his safety by letting her in. Yet he looked at her again and saw only a woman in need, not a threat. She was human, like him, trying to survive. The wind cut sharply across his face as he considered. His hands itched to help, but his instincts screamed caution. Finally, after a long moment, he spoke. "All right," he said slowly, his voice steady but low. "You come in." The snow made each step heavy, and he noticed that she moved differently than he did. Her movements smaller, more deliberate, as if every step required thought and effort. When she reached the porch, he opened the door and the warm light from inside spilled onto the snow, a small golden glow in the gray world. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs. It was small but well kept, with a fire burning in the stone fireplace, sending warmth into every corner. The cowboy stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped in, brushing snow from her coat. Her movements were careful, almost timid, and he noticed her glance around the cabin as if seeing such a place for the first time. He closed the door behind her, and the sound of the wind outside seemed quieter now, softened by the logs and the roof. The woman moved toward the fireplace and held out her hands, letting the heat warm her fingers. Best. She shivered less as the warmth touched her skin, and he could see her shoulders relax. The firelight reflected in her eyes, and for a moment they both just stood there, observing one another in silence. "I thank you, sir," she said, her voice soft and humble. "The storm came so fast. I didn't know where to go. I thought I might not find shelter tonight." He nodded, understanding. "It's a hard winter," he said simply. "You're lucky you found this place." She smiled faintly, a small, grateful expression that made her look younger than she was. He could tell she had been traveling for a long time. Her clothes were worn, patched in places, and her boots were soaked. He gestured toward a blanket draped over a chair. "Sit. You can warm up." She moved to the chair and wrapped the blanket around herself, hugging it close. He watched her for a moment, then began checking the cabin, making sure the fire was strong and that the door was secure. The storm outside was relentless, snow blowing hard against the cabin walls, rattling the windows. It was a reminder of how dangerous the world could be, and how small this cabin was compared to the vast, cold plains outside. After a few minutes he returned to the woman holding a small loaf of bread. "Eat," he said. "You'll need energy if you're to continue your journey tomorrow." She took the bread with both hands, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she said again. "Brrr! You've been very kind." The cowboy nodded but said nothing more. Words were not always needed. He understood her struggle and respected her courage. Even in this harsh land, he knew that simple kindness could mean more than any riches or comfort. They ate in silence, listening to the wind outside and the fire crackling in the fireplace. As the snow continued to fall, he thought about the strange way life worked. Bess. Here, in this vast, empty land, strangers could be threats, or they could be friends in need. This woman had walked for hours through cold and wind, relying on her strength and courage to survive. Now she had reached this small cabin, and he had to decide whether to trust her completely. For the first time that evening, he allowed himself to feel a small warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the warmth of human connection, fragile but real, growing between two people who had never met before, but shared a moment of survival. The storm outside raged and the night grew colder, but inside the cabin the warmth from the fire and the simple act of kindness created a small sanctuary. The cowboy watched her as she finished her bread, noticing the determination in her eyes. She was not helpless. She had survived much to get here. Yet she was still human, and tonight she had found shelter, however temporary. The wind whistled around the cabin, rattling the logs and shaking the roof, but inside there was a quiet sense of peace, however fragile. He leaned against the wall near the door, keeping a watchful eye on the night outside while allowing the warmth to soak into his bones. They were both strangers, two people from very different worlds, brought together by circumstance. And though the storm was still fierce, for now at least they were safe. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering footprints, erasing paths, and hiding the world in white. Burst. Inside, the fire glowed, and the cowboy and the woman shared the quiet comfort of a brief moment of human kindness, both aware that the harsh winter would continue, but also knowing that for this night, best, they had found safety and perhaps something more, a small reminder that even in the coldest storms, connection could survive. The woman sat by the fire, her hands slowly regaining warmth as the heat crept into her fingers and palms. The cowboy watched her quietly, leaning against the rough wooden wall of the cabin, his eyes scanning the shadows where the firelight did not reach. Outside, the storm had not lessened. Snow swirled in furious patterns, blown by the relentless wind. The trees creaked, their branches bending under the weight of snow, and the world beyond the cabin seemed nothing more than a white blur. For a moment they were silent, the crackling fire and the howl of the wind outside the only sounds. It was a silence neither of them found uncomfortable, though both had thoughts racing in their minds. The cowboy wondered about the woman, where she had come from, how far she had traveled, and whether she had family waiting somewhere in the frozen land. The woman, on the other hand, observed the cabin, noting the careful way it was built, the sturdiness of the logs, the small but well-stocked firewood pile. She felt a sense of relief, but also a sense of caution. She had learned that strangers, even kind ones, could be unpredictable, especially in the harsh wilderness. After a while, she spoke again. "I didn't think I would find shelter tonight," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested she had grown up far from the cowboys' plains.
"I've been walking for hours through the snow."
But I thought maybe I would not make it. The cowboy nodded slowly. "The storm caught you by surprise," he said, keeping his voice calm and even. "It's not unusual. This land can be unforgiving in winter." She looked up at him, her eyes bright despite the weariness.
Unforgiving, she repeated, as if tasting the word. Yes.
"I know. My people always said the land has its own rules."
"You respect it, or it will teach you lessons the hard way." He studied her carefully, noting her strength.
Even shivering and tired, there was a determination in her posture, a quiet courage that told him she had survived more than this night. "You've traveled alone?" he asked, his tone cautious but curious. "Yes," she replied. "I had to."
My family, they are far.
I was visiting them, but the snow caught me before I could reach their village. I did not know which way to go, so I followed the wind, hoping it would guide me. The cowboy raised an eyebrow. "Following the wind?" he said, almost with a smile, though his lips stayed serious. "That's one way to survive, I suppose. Shows you trust the land more than your own maps." She gave a small, tired laugh.
"Sometimes the land knows the way better than people do," she said. Then her smile faded, and she wrapped the blanket tighter around herself.
"I have traveled many winters, but this one it is worse than I expected."
He nodded again. "I've seen worse," he said quietly.
Bess.
"But it never gets easier. You always have to be alert, always ready for what might come."
Bear. The woman listened carefully, her eyes reflecting the firelight. She seemed to study his face, reading his expression, and for the first time she asked a question that made him pause. "Do you live here alone?" He looked around the cabin, then back at her. "Yes," he said simply. "This land, it's mine. I take care of it. I live off it. But yes, I am alone." "Bet." She nodded slowly as if she understood.
"Lonely?" she asked softly, her voice almost a whisper.
"Bit," he shrugged. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Most of the time it's just the land and the animals. Sometimes it's peaceful. Sometimes it's very lonely. Nights like this, with the storm raging, remind you of it." She reached for her cup of tea that he had brought earlier, holding it carefully in her hands. "Bectus." "I know," she said quietly. Traveling alone teaches you that too. The wind, the cold, the dark, they make you remember that you are small in the world, but they also make you stronger if you survive them. They sat for a few minutes in silence again. The fire crackled softly, sending small sparks into the air. Outside, the wind howled like a distant wolf, and snow banged against the cabin walls, trying to force its way in. Inside, however, there was a strange comfort in the warmth of the fire and the presence of another human being. The cowboy finally spoke, breaking the silence. "If you plan to stay until the storm passes, you'll need more than a blanket and a fire," he said. He moved to a small wooden chest in the corner, lifting its lid to reveal a few spare clothes, thick socks, and a wool coat. "Here," he said, handing her the coat. "This will help. You can change into something dry. Bay. The snow can chill you faster than the wind if your clothes are wet."
Her eyes widened slightly in surprise, and she shook her head.
I can't take that," she said softly, hesitation clear in her voice. "You need it," he said simply. "It's cold, and it's dangerous out there.
You've walked far already.
You need warmth more than pride right now." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "I appreciate it." She took the clothes, leaving her wet layers behind, and carefully dressed. "Best." The cowboy watched her, noticing the care she took with each movement, making sure the clothes fit properly, the coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. When she finished, she looked warmer, safer, and the relief in her expression was clear. "Better?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said, smiling faintly. "Much better." After that, the conversation became easier. They shared small stories about their lives, each cautious but willing to listen. The woman spoke of her tribe, describing their traditions, how they traveled across the plains during winter, and how families stayed together despite the hardships. She told stories of games they played as children in the snow, and of the foods they prepared during long winters. The cowboy listened carefully, fascinated. He had grown up differently, surviving by himself and learning the ways of the land alone. But her stories were rich and full of life. "Your people know how to survive," he said quietly. "I've learned a lot from living alone, but you have the land in your blood."
"Perhaps," she said, "we are taught from birth to respect the land, to live with it, not against it."
Breath. The snow, the wind, the cold. They are not enemies. They are teachers.
He nodded, thinking about his own life. He had often felt the harshness of winter as an enemy, something to be fought and endured.
But listening to her words, he realized there was a different way to see it, to accept it as part of the world, part of survival, part of life itself. The fire continued to crackle, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin a sense of peace began to settle. Both of them were cautious still, aware that trust takes time, but the shared warmth, the simple act of kindness, and the exchange of stories created a bond.
It was a bond not yet spoken aloud, but present in the quiet glances and shared silences.
The woman glanced at the cowboy, noticing the way he watched the fire, the way he kept one eye on the wind outside, always alert. "You are careful," she said softly. "I have to be," he replied simply. "This land doesn't forgive mistakes." "Yes," she said, "mistakes can be dangerous. But kindness is rare here, and precious." The cowboy looked at her, considering her words. He had offered shelter without knowing if he would regret it, and so far it had brought only a sense of quiet satisfaction, a sense that he had done the right thing. He had kept his caution, but he had allowed himself to trust, even if just a little. Outside, the storm did not let up, but inside the cabin the fire glowed warmly. The woman drank her tea slowly, and the cowboy continued to watch, keeping an eye on the door and windows. He knew the storm might last all night, but for now they were safe. And in that small cabin surrounded by snow and wind, two strangers from very different worlds shared the warmth of a fire, the comfort of human kindness, and the fragile beginning of trust. Night deepened, and the fire burned lower. Both of them were tired, but neither moved to sleep just yet. They were still talking in small bursts, sharing details of their lives, their struggles, their hopes. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault, but inside there was a feeling that the storm could not touch them, at least not while they remained in the cabin, together in quiet understanding. Finally, as the fire burned low and the night grew darker, the woman settled more comfortably into her chair, and the cowboy returned to his place near the wall, leaning back and letting the warmth seep into him. Outside, the world was a frozen, howling storm, but inside, there was light, warmth, and a growing sense of trust between two people who had started the night as strangers, but might leave it changed forever. Storm had not yet passed when dawn began to creep through the small cracks in the cabin walls. The snow outside glowed faintly with the pale morning light, and the wind, though still strong, had softened slightly. Inside the cabin, the cowboy stirred from his light doze by the fire. He watched the woman sleeping in the chair, wrapped in the blanket he had offered. Her breathing was steady now, and the tension from the night before seemed to have left her body. He felt a small sense of relief, knowing she had managed to find a moment of rest after her long, exhausting journey. After a few moments, he quietly moved to the corner where he kept a small kettle. The water inside hissed gently as it warmed over the fire. He added a few dried herbs he had collected earlier in the season, creating a mild, fragrant tea. He poured it carefully into a cup and carried it to the chair where she slept. Perspective. Gently, he nudged her shoulder. "Time to wake up," he said softly. Her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the light and to the warm presence of the fire. "Good morning," she said, rubbing her eyes. "I slept more than I expected."
Thank you. You're welcome, he replied. Drink this.
"It'll help warm you up before breakfast." She took the cup with both hands, blowing on the steaming liquid before taking a sip. The warmth spread through her chest, and a small smile appeared on her face. "This is very kind," she said. You take good care of your cabin and your guests." The cowboy shrugged lightly. "It's my home. I try to keep it in order, and tonight you're my guest." "It's not often I have company." She nodded, sipping her tea slowly, allowing herself to relax a little more. "Company is rare for me too," she said. "Traveling alone teaches you many lessons. You learn to rely on yourself. But sometimes it is good to meet someone else, even if just for a night." The cowboy listened quietly, thinking about her words. He had spent many winters alone, and though he had grown used to solitude, there were times when the loneliness pressed heavily on his mind. Nights like this, when the storm raged outside, reminded him that connection, even brief, could bring a sense of comfort that he had long forgotten.
They spent the next hour in quiet conversation.
She told him about her tribe, describing the patterns of migration they followed during winter and how families worked together to survive. She spoke of the traditions and ceremonies that celebrated the land and the seasons, of games and songs that had kept spirits alive during long winters. Her voice was gentle but confident, and the cowboy found himself listening intently, fascinated by the life she had lived and the knowledge she carried.
In return, he shared his own experiences.
He spoke of his childhood on the plains, the lessons he had learned from his father, and how he had managed to survive alone when he became an adult. He told her about the cattle, the fences, and the routines that kept his life in balance with the land. His stories were simpler, more practical, but she listened with equal interest, asking questions that showed she respected the life he had built for himself. As they spoke, the fire continued to crackle, and the light of the morning began to fill the cabin. Outside, the snow had stopped falling for the moment, though the wind still blew, carrying drifting flakes across the plains. The cabin felt warm and safe, a small bubble of comfort in the harsh wilderness. After some time, the woman stood and stretched, carefully testing her legs after the long night of travel. "I should prepare to continue my journey soon," she said, her tone thoughtful. "The snow is lighter now, and I hope it will remain so long enough to reach the next village." The cowboy nodded. "You'll need more than that blanket to walk far," he said, glancing at her. "I have some extra supplies."
You can take them with you if you need.
I don't want to impose, she said softly.
"You're not imposing," he replied.
The land can be unforgiving, and you need to survive.
That's enough reason to accept help. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice full of gratitude. "Bear." She gathered her things carefully, wrapping her blanket over her shoulders once more. He handed her a small bundle of dried food, enough for a day of travel and a thick pair of socks. Base. They paused for a moment, looking at each other. Neither spoke, but there was an understanding between them now, a sense that the brief connection they had shared had changed something in both of them. Bay. For the cowboy, it reminded him that even in isolation there was value in kindness. For the woman, it reinforced the idea that even strangers could offer safety and comfort when needed. Before she left, she asked, "May I ask your name?" He hesitated. He rarely shared it with anyone, but something about her made him feel it was safe. "Call me James," he said. "I am Ayasha," she replied. "Thank you, James, for your kindness." Then, with the supplies in hand, Ayasha stepped to the door. She opened it and looked outside, where the snow lay thick but undisturbed for the moment. The sky was pale and gray, and the wind had softened just enough to make travel possible. She inhaled deeply, savoring the cold, fresh air, then stepped into the snow. James watched her go, noting how carefully she moved through the snowdrifts, her eyes scanning the land as if reading it for danger. He felt a quiet admiration for her courage. She had come a long way already and would continue on her journey, facing whatever challenges the winter might throw at her. As Ayasha disappeared into the white landscape, James returned to the cabin. He closed the door, letting the warmth of the fire remain inside, and sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on the night and the morning. Storm outside reminded him of the unpredictability of life, of how quickly circumstances could change, and of how small acts of kindness could leave lasting impressions. He began tidying the cabin, stacking firewood, checking the supplies, and making sure everything was in order. The work gave him a sense of purpose, and his mind wandered back to the stories Ayasha had shared. He realized that despite their differences, her life within a close-knit tribe and his life alone on the plains, they shared many of the same lessons: respect for the land, the value of hard work, and the importance of resilience. Hours passed. The snow continued to fall lightly, and the wind shifted direction, blowing in from the north. James sat by the fire again, sipping a cup of water and listening to the quiet sounds of the cabin. He thought about the people he had known, the times he had spent alone, and the brief but meaningful connection he had made with Ayasha. It reminded him that even in the harshest conditions, humans were capable of trust, compassion, and understanding. Later, as the sun rose higher, casting pale light over the snow-covered plains, James stepped outside briefly to check his fences. The snow was soft under his boots, and the tracks Ayasha had made earlier were nearly covered by new snowfall. He thought about her journey, imagining her moving carefully across the plains, using her knowledge and intuition to navigate the frozen land. He felt a quiet hope that she would reach her family safely, carrying with her the warmth of the small cabin and the kindness he had offered. Returning inside, he stoked the fire and prepared a small breakfast for himself. The day ahead would be long, with work on the fences and tending to the cattle, but he felt lighter than he had in weeks. The night had reminded him of the value of human connection and the quiet power of generosity, even in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. By midday, the storm had passed completely. The snow glistened in the bright sunlight, and the plains stretched endlessly in every direction, pure and white. Best. James looked out across the land, thinking about the path Ayasha would take and the courage it would require.
He smiled faintly, knowing that the bond they had shared, however brief, would remain in his memory.
It was a small story in the larger story of the land and the people who lived on it. A story of survival, trust, and kindness in a world that could be as beautiful as it was dangerous.
As the day continued, James continued his work, repairing fences and checking the cattle.
But his mind often drifted back to Ayasha, wondering if she had found shelter for the next night, if she was safe and warm, and if she remembered the small cabin that had offered her rest in a freezing storm. The bond of that single night, the stories they had shared, and the simple acts of kindness created a quiet warmth in both of their hearts, a warmth that the harsh winter could not touch. The wind began to rise again that evening, stronger than it had been during the day. The sun had dipped behind the distant hills, and the cabin was quickly swallowed in shadows. James noticed the first snowflakes falling, small and light at first, but he could feel the change in the air, the sharp bite of winter growing stronger. He checked the fire, making sure the logs were stacked and burning steadily. Nights like this, he had learned, could become dangerous quickly. The land was unpredictable, and a storm could turn violent in minutes. Ayasha had returned to the cabin after spending part of the afternoon gathering herbs and firewood nearby. Psh, psh, she had moved carefully through the snow, her footsteps precise, avoiding hidden patches where the snow might conceal a hazard. When she stepped inside, the warmth hit her like a soft blanket. She smiled faintly at James, who was arranging more logs for the fireplace. "Looks like the storm is coming back," James said, his voice calm but firm. "Bay." He paused and looked at her. "We should be ready. It may get rough tonight." Ayasha nodded, her eyes scanning the windows. "I can feel it in the air," she said. "The wind is stronger and the sky is darkening quickly." She moved to the fire, holding her hands close to the flames, letting them regain heat after the cold outdoors. James went outside briefly to check the fences and the surrounding area. The snow was already thickening, covering the tracks from earlier in the day. Dusk. He noticed the low-hanging branches of the nearby trees, heavy with snow, bending under the weight. One gust could break them and send them crashing down. He returned to the cabin, aware that tonight they would need to work together to protect themselves and the cabin from nature's force. "Inside now," he said firmly as he entered. "We'll need to make sure everything is secure before it worsens." Ayasha moved quickly, her movements sure and deliberate. Together they reinforced the door, checking the latches and bracing it against the growing wind. They moved the heavier furniture closer to the windows to block the draft and prevent the snow from entering. James grabbed extra logs and stacked them carefully, while Ayasha checked the fire, ensuring it had enough fuel to burn through the night. As the storm intensified, the wind outside screamed like a distant animal, bending trees and throwing snow against the cabin walls. The roof creaked under the weight of the accumulating snow, and a few flakes had already begun to find their way inside through small cracks. James tightened the final latch on the door and looked around, satisfied that for now they had done all they could to protect the cabin. But nature was not done with them yet. A particularly strong gust of wind shook the cabin violently, rattling windows and doors. Besides the weight of snow, and fell with a loud crash. Striking the side of the cabin, both James and Ayasha jumped back. Hearts pounding. Hearts pounding. That was close, James said, his voice low. We'll need to watch the trees. Bay. That branch could have done serious damage. Ayasha nodded, her face serious. We should stay alert. This storm will not be gentle. Hours passed, and the snow fell harder. The wind howled like an invisible force, trying to push its way inside. James and Ayasha worked together, taking turns reinforcing weak points in the cabin and stoking the fire to keep it burning brightly. The heat from the flames became a lifeline, the warmth keeping the cold from seeping into their bones. Bay. At one point, the cabin shook again violently, more than before. James moved quickly to the door and opened it slightly to check the outside. Vibration. Snow whipped into his face, and the wind tried to push him back. A smaller branch had fallen nearby, and he could see that the larger trees around the cabin were bending under the storm's force. He closed the door quickly, his heart racing. We need to brace the cabin further, he said urgently. This storm will not pass soon.
Ayasha moved beside him, helping to shift heavier furniture to strategic positions near the walls and windows.
Together they reinforced the weakest points, their hands moving in practiced coordination. Though they had just met, they had fallen into a rhythm, understanding each other without many words. As the night wore on, fatigue began to weigh on them. Their movements slowed, muscles aching from the effort of reinforcing the cabin and keeping the fire strong. Yet neither complained. The danger outside demanded focus, and they knew that if they stopped, even for a moment, the storm could take advantage. At one point, a gust of wind slammed into the cabin with tremendous force. The walls shook violently, and snow rushed in through a small crack near the roof. James and Ayasha acted immediately. He grabbed a heavy piece of wood, pressing it against the crack, while she used a blanket to block the rest of the leak. They worked side by side, coordinating silently, their combined effort keeping the cabin safe from the storm's wrath. During a brief pause in the wind, they looked at each other, catching their breath. We make a good team, James said, giving a faint smile despite the exhaustion.
Ayasha nodded, her eyes reflecting the flickering firelight.
Yes, she said softly. It is easier facing the storm together. The hours stretched on, with the storm continuing its relentless attack. Outside, snow drifted in tall waves, covering the plains, and the trees groaned under the weight of ice and snow. Inside, the cabin remained their sanctuary, a fragile haven strengthened by their joint effort. As they worked, James shared stories from his past, memories of storms he had survived alone, and lessons he had learned. Ayasha listened, her expression attentive, occasionally adding her own experiences of traveling through harsh winters with her tribe. They exchanged survival tips, learning from each other. The exchange of knowledge, coupled with the shared effort to protect the cabin, deepened the bond forming between them. The storm reached its peak around midnight. Snow pounded against the walls, and the wind sounded almost like a roaring beast, but higher. James and Ayasha, though tired, remained vigilant. They reinforced a particularly weak section of the roof where snow had begun to accumulate dangerously, working quickly to prevent it from collapsing. Their hands were numb, their movements stiff, but they persisted, knowing the cabin's safety depended on their effort. At one point, a sudden crack echoed through the cabin. A heavy branch had finally given way and struck the roof. Dust and small bits of snow fell inside, but thanks to their previous work, the roof held. Both of them breathed a sigh of relief, though their hearts were still pounding.
James looked at Ayesha, his eyes reflecting pride and gratitude.
"You've been brave tonight," he said. She smiled faintly, though exhaustion showed in her face. "We both have," she replied. "Together we can face more than we could alone." Hours later, the storm finally began to subside. Psst. The wind lost its fury, and the snow settled quietly on the plains. James and Ayesha were exhausted, but they had survived the night. The cabin, though battered, remained standing, a testament to their combined effort and determination. They sat together by the fire, warming their hands and letting their muscles relax. The danger had passed for now, but both knew the winter would continue to test them. Yet in that small cabin amidst the aftermath of the storm, there was a quiet sense of accomplishment. They had faced the power of nature together and emerged stronger. Ayesha looked around the cabin, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the fire.
"I will never forget this night," she said softly.
James nodded, his gaze on the fire. "Neither will I," he said. "It is rare to meet someone you can trust in such circumstances. Tonight, we learned the value of working together." They shared a quiet smile, a wordless acknowledgement of the bond formed in the harshest of conditions. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world covered in white, silent, and still. Inside, the cabin glowed warmly, a haven strengthened by courage, trust, and cooperation. Though the night had been long and dangerous, James and Ayesha had survived. They had faced the storm together, learned from each other, and discovered that even in the coldest, harshest winters, human kindness and teamwork could make all the difference. And as they sat by the fire, they knew that whatever challenges the land would bring next, they would be ready to face them together. The storm had passed completely by morning. The world outside the cabin was quiet and white, the snow untouched in most places except for the tracks James and Ayesha had made over the past 2 days. The sky was pale, and the sunlight reflected off the snow, creating a dazzling, almost magical glow. The air was still cold, but the wind no longer howled, leaving the plains calm and serene. James stepped outside briefly to breathe in the crisp, clean air. Best. He could see the trees, heavy with snow, swaying gently, and the hills stretching far into the distance. The world felt peaceful now, almost like it had been waiting for this moment of calm. Inside the cabin, Ayesha was stirring, preparing for her journey. She had slept better than she had in days, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and the cabin that had been her refuge. She moved quietly, trying not to wake James as she gathered her things. There was a sense of purpose in her movements, a quiet strength that had carried her this far. She packed the supplies he had given her, the thick coat, dried food, and extra socks, carefully arranging them in her small bag. When James finally woke fully and joined her, he noticed the determination in her eyes. "The snow looks calm now," he said, bass. "It should be easier to travel today." Ayesha nodded. "Yes, the storm is gone, but the land is still difficult to cross. I must be careful." She paused for a moment, looking at him. "Thank you, James, for everything." Breath. "I could not have survived the storm without your help." James shook his head, brushing snow from his coat as he prepared to walk with her to the edge of his property. "Psst. You would have survived," he said. "You're strong and smart." "But, yes, I'm glad I could help. It's rare to meet someone willing to work together in times like these." They walked to the edge of the clearing where the tracks disappeared into the snow-covered plains. The silence of the morning was almost complete, broken only by the faint sound of wind brushing across the hills. But Ayasha paused, taking in the view, as if memorizing every detail. The journey ahead was long, but the moment was quiet, peaceful, and almost sacred. James handed her the bag with supplies one last time. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice calm but serious. "Travel carefully and trust your instincts. The land can be harsh, but it can also guide you if you pay attention." Ayasha accepted the bag with both hands, nodding. "I will," she said softly. "And I will remember this place, and your kindness." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting gratitude, respect, and a touch of sadness at the thought of leaving. "Perhaps we will meet again, someday." James nodded. "Perhaps," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "You've taught me something, too." She tilted her head slightly.
Oh? That even in the hardest times, working together and trusting someone carefully can make all the difference, he said.
"Tonight, the storm was stronger, but we were stronger together. I won't forget that." Ayasha smiled, a small, warm expression that brightened her face. "Nor will I," she said. They shared a quiet moment, standing in the calm of the morning. The sun reflected off the snow, making the world almost sparkle, and the wind whispered softly through the trees. It was a moment of connection, a recognition of what they had shared and survived together. Though their paths would soon separate, the experience had changed them both. Finally, Ayasha turned and began walking through the snow. Her steps were careful, measured, but determined. James watched her disappear into the white landscape, following the faint tracks she left behind. He could see her moving steadily toward the distant village where her family awaited. The journey would be long, but she was prepared, and she was strong. After she had gone out of sight, James returned to the cabin. He closed the door, letting the warmth of the fire fill the space once again. The silence inside was comforting now, no longer tense. He stoked the fire and checked the supplies, preparing for the day ahead. Even though Ayasha was gone, the bond they had formed remained. The cabin felt different now, not just a place of survival, but a place that had hosted a story of trust, kindness, and courage. He sat by the fire for a long while, thinking about the past 2 nights. The storm had been fierce, testing both of them in different ways. It had forced them to work together, to rely on each other, and to face fear without panic. James realized that the experience had reminded him of something he had almost forgotten: the value of connection, the importance of helping someone in need, and the quiet strength that could come from human kindness. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the snow-covered plains, James finally stood and walked outside. The snow glistened under the sunlight, pure and undisturbed except for his own tracks. He walked a short distance to where Ayasha had left, looking out across the plains. The world seemed endless and vast, but also full of possibilities. He thought of the challenges ahead, both for himself and for anyone traveling through this harsh land. He realized that survival was not just about strength or skill, but also about trust, courage, and the willingness to accept help when it was offered. Returning to the cabin, James decided to repair a section of the roof that had been weakened during the storm. He worked steadily, moving with care and precision, knowing that the storm had left its mark but also that the cabin had endured because of their efforts. Each nail he drove and each log he adjusted reminded him of the teamwork and determination that had carried them through the night. Hours passed, and the work continued. The snow outside sparkled in the bright light, and the wind had softened to a gentle whisper. The plains seemed calm and almost peaceful. though James knew that winter was far from over. He thought about Ayesha's journey and hoped she was safe and moving steadily toward her family. The thought brought a small smile to his face, a quiet comfort in the knowledge that she would carry the memory of their shared experience with her. As the day went on, James tended to his cattle and checked the fences, performing the daily routines that kept his life in order. Yet his mind often drifted back to Ayesha, recalling her stories, her courage, and the way she had faced the storm with determination. He realized that the brief time they had spent together had left a lasting impression on him, reminding him that even in isolation, human connection could provide warmth, hope, and strength. Evening came, and the sky turned shades of pink and orange as the sun set. The plains were quiet again, the snow glowing softly in the fading light. James sat by the fire, sipping a cup of tea, and reflected on everything that had happened. The storm, the shared work, the quiet conversations, they all felt like a small miracle in the harshness of winter. He realized that life on the plains was not just about surviving the cold and the storms, but about recognizing moments of trust, kindness, and courage, even in the smallest gestures. That night, as he prepared for sleep, James thought about the bond he had shared with Ayesha. It was brief, but meaningful. It reminded him that even strangers could teach each other valuable lessons, and that the world, though often harsh, contained moments of beauty and warmth. He closed his eyes, feeling a quiet sense of peace, knowing that they had both been changed by the experience.
Outside, the wind blew softly across the plains, rustling the snow and trees.
The world was calm, serene, and silent, a stark contrast to the fury of the storm that had passed. Inside the cabin, the fire burned gently, filling the room with warmth and light. James lay down, feeling the comfort of the cabin, the satisfaction of having survived the storm, and the quiet joy of having shared a moment of connection with another human being. In the days that followed, James continued his life on the plains, tending to his cabin and his cattle. Yet he carried with him the memory of Ayesha, her courage, and the brief but meaningful bond they had formed. He often thought of her as he walked through the snow, imagining her moving carefully across the plains toward her family, facing challenges with the same strength and determination she had shown in the storm. Though their paths had separated, the experience remained with both of them. For James, it was a reminder of the value of trust and kindness. And for Ayesha, it was a memory of a safe haven and a person who had offered help when it was most needed. Their story was one of survival, courage, and human connection. A story that would stay with them, quietly shaping the way they saw the world and the people in it. The plains stretched endlessly in every direction, covered in snow and light. Life on the land continued, harsh and beautiful, challenging and rewarding. And in a small cabin, strengthened by a storm and warmed by shared effort, James felt a quiet hope. He knew that no matter what winter might bring next, he had faced it with courage, learned the value of trust, and discovered that even in the coldest, most difficult times, human connection could provide warmth that no storm could ever take away.